The United States of America, nation of immigrants. Immigrants from all over the world have contributed to this country's thriving, diverse society. The stories and experiences of those from Japan and their descendants, Japanese Americans, have a lot to teach us about America's ethnic and cultural diversity, democracy, and the struggle for equality. The first wave of Japanese immigrants arrived in the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1868. After the U.S. borders were closed to Chinese immigrants in 1882, immigration from Japan surged. These migrant workers, mostly men, planned on going home after earning money, but gradually some settled in the U.S. They are known as Issei, the first generation. Prejudicial laws of the time meant Issei were ineligible to become naturalized U.S. citizens and, in some states, even denied the right to own land. Despite facing harsh, racial discrimination, Issei supported each other, working in farming and fishing or starting their own businesses, and eventually started their own families and communities. However, as the Japanese American population grew, anti-Japanese sentiment rose. It eventually led to the Immigration Act of 1924, which barred all immigrants from Japan. In the Japanese American community, the number of Nisei, second generation, continued to grow. As American citizens by birth, Nisei were integrated into American schools and society, while at home they were raised with traditional Japanese values and customs. On December 7, 1941, war between Japan and the U.S. broke out after the Japanese Navy attacked Pearl Harbor. In 1942, Japanese and Japanese Americans living on the West Coast were forcibly removed from their homes and incarcerated in concentration camps by the United States government. 120,000 were incarcerated. Of those, 2/3 were American citizens. Life in camp was difficult. Families had no privacy and no traditional family structure to rely on. Guard towers watched over each camp, with their rifles turned toward the incarcerees. People carried on as best as they could, telling each other, "Shigata ga nai," or "it can't be helped." Many young Nisei men served in the military, in the 100th Infantry Battalion, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and the Military Intelligence Service. In many cases, they were drafted out of the concentration camps and left their families in the camps to join the war effort. Others resisted joining the military out of principle and were arrested, jailed, and in some cases even deported for their refusal. Regardless of what each individual chose to do, it was a difficult decision. After the war ended, Japanese Americans tried to resume their lives. However, they still faced intense hostility. The discriminatory laws against them were still in place, and many who lost their homes and belongings had no place to return to. Some moved to the Midwest and East Coast in search of less discrimination, although most eventually moved back to the West Coast. As they started over, they rarely spoke about their wartime experience. They were too humiliated, hurt, and afraid of more discrimination. Instead, they focused on rebuilding their lives. In 1952, changing laws meant that Issei were finally allowed to naturalize and become U.S. citizens. When Hawaii became the 50th state in 1959, the first Japanese Americans were elected to the United States Congress. The 1960s was a time of change for the United States. Black Americans, who had faced discrimination for generations, fought for equality in the civil rights movement. During this period, people of other races who had long been forced to assimilate into white American culture had a renewed sense of pride in their identity and were eager to forge new identities as African Americans and Asian Americans. With this movement, Sansei, third-generation Japanese Americans, were inspired by their identity and started to rediscover their own history. They organized to demand reparations and a formal apology from the U.S. government for the wartime incarceration, in an effort known as the Redress Movement. In 1988, over 40 years after the incarceration, the United States government acknowledged the fundamental injustice of the removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was a reaffirmation of the U.S. Constitution's principles of equality, freedom, and justice. This moment was not only significant for Japanese Americans, but for all Americans. Now, the Japanese American community in the United States has grown beyond those who experienced wartime incarceration. With the increase of mixed-race people and post-war immigrants, there are Japanese Americans who live with diverse backgrounds and histories. Japanese American culture continues to grow and thrive. Opening its doors in 1992, the Japanese American National Museum serves as the largest museum in the U.S. dedicated to sharing the experiences of Americans of Japanese ancestry. With the mission to promote an understanding and appreciation of America's ethnic and cultural diversity, JANM is committed to amplifying the power of history to inform the present and shape a future based on social justice and a vibrant culture of democracy.